Am I on? There we go. Thanks very much for having us here tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'll steal Russell's joke and talk about me being Daniel going into the lion's den now. And I'll also ask you to bear with me. I've got a cold or a flu or some other thing. I've suddenly gotten sick. And I figured the best interpretation of that is that God knows that I've got this really devastating argument. And that He's hedging His bets to protect Russell and Jesus. So just keep that in mind. So rather than deal with a bunch of the really interesting, very specific claims that Russell's making, I'm going to sort of dodge, and I'm going to make some really broad stroke claims, and maybe fill in some of the background here as I see it. Excuse me. And do some history. And Russell and I hashed out a lot of this. I think we actually agree on a bunch of it. Let me set that up. This thing doesn't work as readily for me. There we go. Okay, so here's the dilemma as I see it. There's this event that's alleged to have happened. Oops. There's this event, that's the R over there, the resurrection, is alleged to have happened around 30, 35, Common Era, AD. And we stand here in 2010 wondering, perhaps, maybe you're not wondering, you should, wondering about whether or not you should believe whether or not that event happened. And the question is really about, and this is, Russell's approach, is the question is really about your information, the information that you've got channeled from the vicinity of that event to you now 2,000 years later, roughly, or thereabouts. And as I see it, we can sort of organize this discussion. I got a complicated point to make here, but we can organize this by divvying up some stages of transition that the information about this event goes through. So, right around the alleged event, are the alleged eyewitnesses. I'm going to call them alleged because what stands to be demonstrated is that they really were witnesses to this event. So that's the stories that you get ultimately in the gospel accounts. Those people then, roughly, there's a bit of a lag time here. There we go. Roughly between the period around 35 when Jesus is thought to have died, and then when Mark, the earliest, by most people's reckonings, the earliest gospel that gets written in 60 or thereabouts, we get an unknown number of people repeating the story. The story spreads, no doubt. Lots of people are talking. Don't know how many, if any, of the alleged eyewitnesses were actually speaking to the authors of the Gospels. But then clustered around, say, 65 to 90 or thereabouts, you get the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all written. And those authors are getting their information from an unknown number of sources. We don't know, as I understand it, we don't know who the authors of those 4 books are. And we don't know how many people they talked to, or who they talked to, or how they got their information. And of course, Paul figures in here importantly too, as Russell's been making the point. So that's 30 to 90 years later or so, 30 to 60 years later or so is when the story first gets written down, first gets recorded. Unfortunately, we don't have those stories. What we've got are copies of those stories. And what we can actually go look at, what you could see, you don't have to go to the Vatican Library someplace to see this, but what you could actually get your hands on, and I think the oldest surviving manuscript we have is maybe a fragment of John from around the 250s, 275, thereabouts. So really we're talking about 200 plus years between when the event happens and when you could actually lay eyes on something that's the record of it, right? With all of these intervening stages that transition between from you to that source of information. Another relevant point to make here at this stage is that there's this event, or series of events. It turns out, I think by most scholars reckoning these days, that the events are rather diffuse, but I'm going to call it the canonization, the canons created. So in the late 200s, it turns out that in the intervening previous 100, 150 years, there's been writings and documents and manuscripts and stories circulating, proliferating all about the whole region surrounding the Jesus question. And there are perhaps thousands of different documents. But what starts emerging in the late 200s, the historians tell us, are a single list, the list that you now know as sort of the modern Christian Bible with its books and its composition of the New Testament. But that list starts getting sort of settled on by more and more people. And there's a number of deliberate attempts, some of them quite explicit, to take this large body of information, all these different stories, and many of them telling very different stories than the one that we've just been talking about, and carve out a particular account. So we've got all of this diverse information, all of these different gospels and different writings and the like all circulated about, and the people who are rising to power and influence in the church and in the growing movement are then taking all of those and carving out a particular set and saying, this is the set that we're going to canonize. This is the Bible. This is the thing that we are going to recognize, acknowledge as the real thing, as the important thing, right? And many of the others get destroyed or get banned or deemed heretical and cast aside. So there's a very conscious effort in the midst of all of this. Not only is there's this filtration process going through these various stages, but there's all this proliferation of other information circulating around out there, and you've got some people now picking out a particular account with one story in mind. Where the point of that story, of course, is the resurrection, the one that Russell's just been focusing on. All right, so what I want to ask then is, given the rough path through history that this information has taken from the alleged event to you, should you believe it? That's the central question as I see it. All right, so let me introduce a concept here. I don't like my little metaphor here, but I'm going to use it because it really illustrates the point well. It misleads as much as it leads, I think, but I'm going to use it anyway. I want to talk about signal degradation and talk about these layers and what happens when you layer in all of these levels of filtration, if you will, in between you and the source. All right, so I've got a cell phone and a bunch of cell phone towers. So here's a question. What are the odds that a piece of data fed into the system will be accurately transmitted from one end of that system to the other? And the way you figure this out, a simple point from statistics, simple point from inductive reasoning, is that the fidelity of the overall system, or the odds of something successfully making out the other end of this whole thing, depends on the fidelity of each link in the chain. So what's that mean? Well, suppose that each one of the links has 80% fidelity. There's an 80% chance that if you put something into it, it'll come out the other side successfully, come out, resembling what it intended as. So if that happens, then you've got 5 links here in my picture. So you've got 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8 equals 0.32. That is to say, there's a 32% chance that if you feed a bit of data into that system, where it's got that fidelity rating, it's going to come out the other side. Of course, what that means then is that the odds are better that it won't come out the other side than that it will in this case. And partly what I want to get at here is the notion of amplification of doubts. And what's worrisome about, what's troubling about the resurrection question here is that there's so many regions of layers of filtration between you and the information, and there's so many questions that are unanswered about what was going on, what was happening at each one of these stages. So, and the other important part here is the multiplication, right? That you get 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8, and quickly, even if it turns out that a particular link in the chain has a relatively high fidelity rating, same thing happens if you run it up to 0.9, 0.95. It doesn't take very long at all with the accumulation of those sorts of stages, even when each individual member is highly reliable, the odds accumulate and you quickly get below the point where you should accept the claim. Where the threshold here, standard probability point, the threshold here is 0.5, 50%. Once it drops below that, you've got better evidence to think that it's false than it's true once you're going through that sort of system. That is, it's more likely than not in this particular case that the information won't make it. Now let me make my point about why I don't like my metaphor. What I don't like about my metaphor is that it's using cell phones. And everybody in the room's got a cell phone, and you use it constantly. Many of you are using it right now, probably, if you're like my students, using it in class.